set the scene in your mind for a second. Um, you've recently found yourself standing in one of those boutique stationery shops, gently running your hands over a sleek, like, $30 letter-bound journal.
Oh, yeah. We've all been there.
Right, or maybe you've been up late scrolling online, seriously eyeing a vintage heavy metal film camera, and you tell yourself that this object is the key. This is how you escape screen fatigue. This is how you reclaim your focus from all the digital noise.
It is an incredibly seductive narrative. I mean, the promise, the salvation from the relentless pace of modern technology is just one tactile, mechanical object away.
It really is. And we've got a fascinating stack of anthropological essays and cultural critiques today that completely deconstruct that feeling. So we are looking at the massive cultural revival of analog tools. The resurgence of vinyl records, manual typewriters, film cameras, and those really intricate paper planning systems.
Right, the whole analog ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's unpack this, because this trend is constantly marketed to you as a gritty, authentic rebellion against the digital world. But according to the sources we're examining today, this analog revival is actually the ultimate digital paradox.
Yeah, and that paradox forms the absolute foundation of what these anthropologists are observing. Because when you peel back that warm, vintage aesthetic, what you find is, well, it's not an exodus from the digital realm at all.
Not even a little bit.
Not really. Instead, it operates as what they call a digital lifestyle category. So it is an online aesthetic that relies entirely on physical props.
Wow. And looking at how we actually interact with these tools in our daily lives exposes a glaring irony right out of the gate. The research introduces this concept called the content loop, and I have to say it fundamentally changes how you view these analog hobbies.
Oh, totally. The content loop is such a brilliant way to frame it.
Right, because the modern analog enthusiast goes out, they shoot a roll of 35mm film, or they spend 20 minutes meticulously writing out their schedule in a premium Leuchtturm or Midori notebook with a fancy fountain pen.
Mm-hmm.
And then, almost instinctively, they immediately photograph that act to post it on Instagram or TikTok. I mean, the act of unplugging becomes the very content they plug right back into the algorithm.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is the embedded digital infrastructure that supports that entire illusion. The sources really highlight that this quote-unquote authentic analog life is inextricably tethered to the digital matrix it claims to resist.
It's like you can't have one without the other anymore.
Exactly. Just consider the pipeline of analog discovery for a second. A listener discovers an obscure, highly authentic vinyl record specifically because a sophisticated Spotify streaming algorithm analyzed their listening habits and recommended the artist.
Right, the algorithm did the heavy lifting.
Yeah. And then they go and purchase that vintage turntable on a massive global e-commerce platform. And when they finally take those analog photos we were talking about, they drop off the negatives to be developed only to request high-resolution digital scans.
So they can tweak them on their computers.
Precisely. They alter the contrast and color grade in Adobe Lightroom or whatever digital editing software they use. The material layer is physical, sure, but the distribution, discovery, and ultimate consumption, that is entirely digital.
It's basically digital culture wearing a much more expensive photogenic costume. The authenticity is largely a performance engineered for a digital audience. Though I do have to push back just a bit on the cynicism of that critique.
Sure, go for it.
Doesn't looking back at simpler times naturally bring a sense of genuine peace? I mean, before smartphones, people simply weren't bombarded by global crises and constant notifications buzzing in their pockets. There is a real history of slower, more deliberate living that people are tapping into, right?
That's a fair point. But the anthropological critiques address that nostalgia directly. They actually refer to it as amnesia wearing rose-tinted glasses.
Amnesia wearing rose-tinted glasses.
That is quite a phrase.
It is, and it really highlights how highly selective our cultural memory can be. I mean, we romanticize the tactile clatter of the mid-20th century typewriter or the mechanical click of an analog camera. But we systematically edit out the intense isolation, the incredibly limited access to information, and just the sheer everyday friction that characterized the pre-digital era.
So we're just remembering the good parts.
Exactly. The longing we see today is for a heavily curated cinematic version of the past. It is an aestheticized history that is completely stripped of its actual real-world limitations.
That reframing asks a pretty difficult question of you, the listener. Because when you choose an analog tool, when you drop the needle on that record player or open that expensive planner, are you doing it for the quiet peace it brings you in an empty room?
Or are you, even subconsciously, doing it for the identity it signals to others? because the desire to prove to the world that you are a deep, intentional, and unplugged person often overshadows the actual utility of the object.
And that tension, the tension between intent and identity, it leads naturally into the functional reality of these tools.
Mm.
Because if the authenticity is often a performance, we have to examine what happens to the actual work or the art or the productivity these tools are supposed to facilitate.
Which brings us to a concept the researchers call the friction tax. And the friction tax is such a brilliant way to describe how the analog subculture romantically rebrands inefficiency.
It really is. Slowness is suddenly treated as a moral virtue.
Right. The assumption is that because a process takes significantly longer and requires more physical labor, the end result must be inherently superior. We celebrate the deliberateness of shooting 36 frames on a roll of film instead of just rattling off 300 on a digital sensor.
Or the ritual of carefully cleaning a turntable stylus, aligning the tone arm and then having to flip the record every 20 minutes.
Exactly. But the research warns that we are dangerously confusing the pleasure of use with the superiority of outcome.
Yeah, and the audiophile world provides one of the clearest examples of this conflation. Because you constantly hear about the unique warmth of vinyl, right? It's positioned as the only legitimate way to hear music as the artist intended.
Oh, people are fiercely defensive about vinyl warmth.
They are. However, the music case for vinyl is heavily contested by audio engineers. The sources cite extensive data from controlled, double-blind listening tests.
Okay, what do the tests show?
Well, when properly mastered, uncompressed digital audio is volume matched and played alongside a pristine vinyl pressing, they are frequently completely indistinguishable to the human ear.
Wait, really? Even to the self-proclaimed audiophiles who swear they can hear the analog warmth?
Even them.
The idea that they can't actually identify the physical format in a blind test completely undermines the whole technical argument for vinyl.
It does, because it reveals the mechanism of perception. The perceived superiority of the sound isn't actually radiating from the physical grooves of the polyvinyl chloride. It is generated by the brain's expectation bias. So it's all in our heads, basically. The human brain is a prediction engine. When it observes the ritual of the physical format, the financial investment, the unwrapping of the album, the careful placement of the needle, it actually primes the auditory cortex to perceive a richer, more significant experience.
That is wild.
Yeah, you are paying a friction tax for a sensory ritual, and your neurological response mistakes that extra physical effort for technical audio excellence.
That sounds remarkably like deciding to commute to the office on a horse instead of a car, and then claiming you're a much more dedicated, superior employee just because it took you 3 hours of intense physical labor to get to your desk.
That is a perfect analogy. The effort becomes the entire point.
It completely overshadows the actual goal. And this leads to a psychological trap the sources call preparation theater, which is where instead of doing the work, you spend 3 months researching the perfect mechanical keyboard switches. Or you're hunting down the exact right archival, acid-free paper for a writing project.
Oh, it is a highly sophisticated form of procrastination.
It really is. You construct this elaborate runway of analog tools just to avoid the terrifying actual work of creation.
And preparation theater thrives on analog tools because physical media is inherently rigid. And we really need to address the functional limitations of that rigidity, specifically the fragility of physical information.
Which we forget about when we're romanticizing it.
Totally. We've developed a profound tactile fetish for paper, but in the context of modern information management, paper is functionally obsolete. If you take a year's worth of brilliant, interconnected notes in a physical journal, those insights are locked in a linear sequence.
Right. You cannot query them?
No. You cannot cross-reference them instantaneously. They are neither searchable nor indexable.
The luxury of using paper today relies on the fact that you don't actually need to retrieve that information efficiently. And the risk of total loss is staggering. I mean, decades of intellectual effort can be erased by a single spilled cup of coffee, right?
Yeah.
Or a misplaced bag on the subway, or a house fire.
Which is terrifying when you think about it.
It is. And the much maligned digital ecosystem solves this seamlessly. A lost smartphone is a minor inconvenience because the data is completely decoupled from the hardware. You log into a new device and restore your entire cognitive workspace from a cloud backup in 10 minutes.
Yeah, the perceived authenticity of the paper notebook offers absolutely zero protection against the permanence of physical destruction.
Which brings us to the socioeconomic reality of maintaining this lifestyle. Because the analog craze frequently cloaks itself in anti-consumerist, minimalist rhetoric. Framing the movement as a rejection of massive tech monopolies.
Sure, that's the branding.
Right. However, the anthropologists point out that this lifestyle has been enthusiastically commodified into a premium consumer category. Now, as a quick caveat to the listener, our role today isn't to take a stance on modern capitalism, but rather to impartially unpack how the researchers view this specific economic shift.
And they argue that the analog revival transforms everyday tools into a status hierarchy.
It essentially functions as a Veblen good. A luxury item whose appeal increases precisely because it is expensive and impractical.
Exactly. And the sources draw a stark contrast here. For a working-class individual, the smartphone is the most rational, powerful, and cost-effective tool for survival, connection, and economic mobility.
Because it consolidates everything: a camera, a bank, a post office, and a library all into one device.
Exactly. Therefore, for the affluent, buying inconvenience, like purchasing a $2,000 vintage manual camera when a pocket-sized phone captures objectively sharper images, is a deliberate mechanism to distinguish themselves from the masses.
It's a flex.
It is. It signals I have the vast resources, the physical space, and the luxury of time required to do things the hard, inefficient way.
When digital efficiency becomes cheap and ubiquitous, friction itself becomes a luxury good. You are quite literally purchasing the privilege of inefficiency.
Yep.
But here's where it gets really interesting, though. There's another layer to this feeling of moral superiority, and it hinges on the environmental angle, because I think a lot of us instinctively feel that buying a physical book, a vinyl record, or shooting film is somehow greener or more natural than buying another piece of electronic hardware.
Feels grounded, right?
Yeah, it feels disconnected from server farms and rare earth mining.
Well, the sources identify that exact sentiment as an anthropological delusion.
Ouch. Delusion is a strong word.
It is, but when you meticulously analyze the ledger of environmental impact, the narrative completely flips. Let's just look at the mechanisms of production. Vinyl records are incredibly petroleum dependent. The manufacturing involves heating polyvinyl chloride pellets using massive amounts of steam energy.
And then pressing them with tons of hydraulic force.
Exactly. The process is highly chemically intensive and relies on fossil fuels at every single stage.
And the chemical reality of film photography is arguably worse. The romanticized darkroom relies on heavy metals and highly toxic chemical baths like developers, stop baths, and fixers that frequently become hazardous waste.
Not to mention the water usage.
Right. And even physical books, the most beloved of our analog tools, require massive logging operations, industrial bleaching, heavy inks, and a staggering logistical transport footprint just to move heavy pallets of paper from printing presses to warehouses to local bookstores.
And this is where we really have to compare the life cycles. Now, digital technology absolutely has a severe manufacturing footprint regarding rare earth metals and server energy. No one is denying that.
Right. The servers use a massive amount of power.
Yes, but the distinction the researchers highlight is the marginal ongoing cost. Once you own a digital device, the marginal resource cost of downloading one more high-fidelity audio file or taking one more digital photograph or downloading an ebook is near zero.
Ah, I see.
Contrast that with the heavy, ongoing resource extraction required to physically produce, package, and transport every single new analog item. The confident assumption that the physical world is inherently greener than the digital one is fundamentally flawed when you analyze it at scale.
So if we look at the complete picture the sources have painted so far, the analog lifestyle is often a status symbol for the affluent. It is environmentally taxing, it is highly inefficient, and it relies on digital infrastructure to even exist.
It's a pretty heavy critique.
It is, but despite knowing all of that, why on earth do we still crave it so deeply? Because that craving is undeniable. You listening right now likely still feel the pull of that letter journal or that record player.
Oh, absolutely.
And this brings us to the psychological root of the entire craze. It is our desperate, flailing attempt to cure our own digital burnout.
And we should validate that the burnout is completely real. The psychological toll of the modern attention economy is immense.
Oh, for sure.
But the anthropological critique here is profound. The digital overwhelm we are experiencing is a systemic infrastructural problem. It is engineered by algorithms designed to harvest human attention. Yet, instead of addressing or regulating that systemic issue, we attempt to solve it with an individual, consumer-based coping mechanism.
We try to buy our way out of a structural crisis by purchasing a paper planner.
Exactly. We genuinely believe the notebook is a magical shield against the algorithm. We think the texture of the paper will somehow ward off the notifications.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, swapping an Android device for a mechanical typewriter does not magically rewire your neural pathways, right?
Good.
Or grant you instant mental discipline.
No, it doesn't. And that is the core fallacy at the heart of the movement. The sources conceptualize this as the portable, anxious mind.
Calling it the portable, anxious mind completely flips the script for me. Because it suggests the tool itself was never the actual problem, our own internal restlessness is.
Precisely. If your brain has been trained to constantly seek novelty, shifting from a screen to a piece of paper doesn't eliminate the anxiety. You just transfer it.
Right. An anxious mind seeking escape from the discomfort of deep work will compulsively and obsessively reorganize the layout of a bullet journal. It will spend hours color-coding a calendar or ruling perfect lines, avoiding the actual task just as effectively as if it were doom-scrolling on social media.
The physical analog tool does not cure the underlying psychological compulsion. It merely changes the physical object of your distraction. You are still avoiding the present moment, just with more aesthetically pleasing props.
So what does this all mean then? Do the sources suggest we just surrender to the screen? Like, do we accept our digital fate, throw our notebooks in the recycling bin, and pledge unquestioning allegiance to the cloud?
No, not at all. The researchers do not dismiss analog tools entirely. And this is where the analysis pivots to how we can actually extract redeeming, genuine value from physical media.
Okay, good. So there is some hope.
There is. But doing so requires us to ruthlessly strip away the ideology, the aesthetic posturing, and the identity signaling. The sources acknowledge that physical tools possess real, undeniable cognitive benefits, but strictly in specific, targeted contexts.
While the defense they mount for physical books is particularly strong when it comes to complex reading.
Oh, the reading data is
It
fascinating.
really is. It turns out the brain interacts with physical text entirely differently than it does with pixels. The cognitive science shows that when we read a physical book, the hippocampus uses spatial memory to build a mental map of the information.
Right, like remembering where a paragraph was on the page.
Exactly. You remember that a specific fact was located on the bottom left of the page, roughly a third of the way through the thickness of the book. That haptic feedback, the actual topography of the text, anchors the memory. The endless, featureless scroll of a digital screen disrupts that spatial mapping, which is why retention for dense material is often much higher with paper.
And this raises an important question about how we utilize limitation. We discussed the friction tax earlier, but there was actually a positive counterpart to it, which is generative constraint.
Generative constraint. Okay, unpack that.
So having a finite roll of 36 exposures on a film camera genuinely forces a photographer to engage their working memory and deliberate over composition, lighting, and framing. It short-circuits the reactive spray and pray mentality of digital shooting, where you just take 1,000 photos and hope one works.
Ah, I see. So it slows you down in a good way.
Yes. The vital distinction the researchers make is moving from ideology to intent.
Meaning the constraint must be genuinely productive for the specific work you are doing, rather than just serving as a romantic pose for social media.
Exactly that principle. The sources advocate for a pragmatic balance. You utilize digital tools for what they excel at, right? Frictionless efficiency, instantaneous searchability, massive scale, and secure storage.
Right.
And you reserve analog tools for what they do best: active leisure, focused physical presence, and deep tactile engagement. Analog tools are incredibly useful servants, but they are terrible masters. And they are certainly not magical cures for modern anxiety.
That is the ultimate takeaway for you, listening to this deep dive. The most genuinely analog act you can possibly perform is the quiet, unphotographed, uncommented use of whatever tool works best for you in that specific moment.
Yes.
It involves no performative identity, no community status signaling, no cultural statement engineered for an algorithm. It is just you, the tool, and the quiet focus of the experience.
Because true mindfulness is a cognitive filter you must actively cultivate within your own mind. It's not a physical prop you can purchase in a boutique. If your primary motivation for using an analog tool is to signal your depth or intentionality to a digital audience, well, you have fundamentally missed the point of the tool entirely.
We have to wrap up our deep dive here, but let's summarize the incredibly complex dynamic we've unpacked today. The fatigue of the modern digital age is real, and the desire to escape the attention economy is entirely justified.
Absolutely.
But purchasing a vintage lifestyle aesthetic is not the cure. You cannot buy your way out of the matrix by purchasing a $30 notebook you discovered via a digital feed. True intentionality isn't derived from the texture of the page, it is forged by the discipline of the mind.
And that cognitive discipline is entirely portable. Once you cultivate the ability to focus and sit with your own thoughts, it does not matter if you are typing on a glowing OLED screen or scratching ink onto parchment with a feather quill. The depth of the work comes from you, not the interface.
I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over as you go about your day. We've established that the modern analog craze is heavily driven by this desire to perform authenticity for a digital audience. We desperately want to be seen as intentional and grounded, but it makes you wonder, if true authenticity is completely invisible to the digital world, how much of your current identity, your hobbies, and your passions would still exist tomorrow if you knew you could never, ever post about them again? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the tools you use, and we'll see you next time.